I don't have any more money to go back and forth, and there's no place to go back and forth to. I left the hotel. I'm here now. What do I do? When are they going to get me on a flight?
All together now, make it stop. Long lines and the long, hard road to catch a flight. Days after a deadly collision at LaGuardia, the runway still closed, and that only adds to the backup. We're also watching the travel impacts from a congressional impasse over funding for ICE and the TSA. Also in Washington, there's another new proposal aimed at ending America's travel chaos. Will this bring Democrats and Republicans inside that building together? We're watching. Plus, President Donald Trump says the war in Iran is already won, while at the same time, Mr. Trump considers sending in ground forces. And then we also have new video showing the very moment an American man held for months by the Taliban steps off of a plane and into the arms of his family in Texas. I'm Reed Cowan. You're watching CBS News 24/7. Let's go. Okay, you're seeing it here behind me in time-lapse video. Lines for hours all over the United States. Really, you could say lines for days. TSA agents caught in the middle of a congressional stalemate. They're faced with a choice right now: work for free or just don't show up to work. A lot of them are not showing up for work. Their eyes, like yours, the traveling public, pointed at your elected representatives in Congress. So here's where we are at this hour. Senate lawmakers signal closing in on a deal to try to end that partial U.S. government shutdown, which has left DHS and TSA without the funding they need to keep going. The CEO of United Airlines, meanwhile, spoke with CBS News senior transportation correspondent Chris Van Cleet.
I think it's unconscionable that our politicians haven't gotten this done, and that we have security agents that are not being paid and they're still showing up, and kudos to them for doing that.
How much longer can this go on?
Well, hopefully it's going to be over soon. You're right. It gets worse every day as it goes by. But the crazy thing about this is that, that's what causes our politicians to get it done. It's ridiculous to me that it has to get bad before they can get a deal done. But please get the deal done soon.
Right, because you are literally watching the impacts of politics on people. Passengers say they are the ones left paying the price for all the back and forth in Washington. Listen.
They said at 6:30 they want me to go back and stand in line and then hopefully get a flight out. But they're not going to guarantee me anything. What am I supposed to do, sleep on the floor? This is insane.
It's the first time I ever experienced this in my entire life. I hope this changes in a couple days, because this is crazy.
It's too long. We've been here for like an hour already. It's not moving nowhere. They need more workers and stuff.
About 2.5 hours so far, and it looks like probably another hour or so to go. Yeah, it's insane.
So meanwhile, this just in from Houston's airport top boss, who paints a picture of the crisis. He says his team has literally had to reassign hundreds of employees. They're even pulling them from the IT departments, from the maintenance departments to do the job of the TSA. In fact, he tells us the situation is not sustainable. CBS News' Nicole Skanga picks up the story from Houston's main airport.
Senate Republicans and the White House are brokering a deal to potentially reopen the Department of Homeland Security. But so far, it seems not many in Washington too keen on this. Passengers here in Houston who we've been talking to say it's already too late. The security line here in Terminal E snaking around 3 different floors, starting in the subway corridor, coming upstairs through baggage claim into the ticketing line. It's both an indoor and an outdoor line with limited access to food, water, air conditioning, even service. Travelers say that they are frustrated, but we got to hand it to them. Most of them packed their patience here today. A lot of folks anticipating these long lines and showing up extra early for their flights. In fact, when we arrived this morning, we found travelers who were actually asleep outside of this TSA security screening point just so they could be among the first in line once things opened up. Now, DHS has surged some extra personnel, including ICE officers who have been helping direct traffic and hand out water. But really, it's those TSA officers that are the ones screening passengers, looking at the X-ray machines and observing any security anomalies. And they have been calling out at high rates, particularly here in Houston, where the TSA sick-out rate on Monday was around 36%. It's part of the reason we're seeing all of this buildup. And among the travelers here, we're even spotting some officials, former officials. We saw Bill Barr, the former U.S. Attorney General, waiting in line. He had told our team that he had been here for about 2 hours in general screening. So clearly, everyone has to wait in line here. We should mention that Delta has also suspended special services that are typically reserved for escorting members of Congress through the terminal. They say that'll remain suspended until the end of this shutdown. And again, passenger after passenger we've been talking to here in Houston says not only should members of Congress have to experience all of the travel inconveniences, but they should forego their own paychecks until TSA officers are paid too. Reporting from Houston, I'm Nicole Skanga. I'll send it back to you.
And if still shut down this Friday, we will have reached nearly $1 billion in missed paychecks. Many in our workforce have missed bill payments, received eviction notices, had their cars repossessed and utilities shut off, lost their child care, defaulted on loans, damaged their credit line, and drained their retirement savings. Some are sleeping in their cars, selling their blood and plasma, and taking on second jobs to make ends meet, all while being expected to perform at the highest level when in uniform to protect the traveling public.
Real life impacts, right? That's a senior Transportation Security Administration official testifying about the realities that TSA agents face while lawmakers fail to come to an agreement on how to fund the Department of Homeland Security. So here's where we are at this hour. Senate Republicans say an offer is on the table. Senate Democrats say the offer does not go far enough to make reforms on ICE.
That the easiest path is to fund the critical components of Homeland Security, which includes TSA, FEMA, Coast Guard. There are important components within the Secret Service that are funded within Homeland Security. Those are the important pieces that should be funded.
This is not your grandfather's Democrat Party. They have crazy policies, and now they have deadly, very tragic consequences.
So let's go live to CBS News congressional reporter Torian Small. Torian, I hesitate to call this a deal yet because we don't know if there is a deal at hand. I know the traveling public would really love to be able to say there was. Are we at deal phase, or are we still in negotiation and stalemate phase?
I mean, we'll see. One of the things you mentioned is that Republicans offered a proposal at the start of the week that gave a lot of lawmakers across the aisle hope and optimism that we could be closer to ending this DHS shutdown. The language of that proposal is what didn't sit well with Democrats. Even those moderate Democrats who were really itching to work with this administration and with Republicans to get something across the finish line. The sticking point for them is in the fact that there are two major operational components to ICE. There's Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, and this other part which focuses on enforcement removal operations, or ERO. HSI would be funded under the proposal that Republicans put out, and Democrats say that just doesn't meet the moment that they've been asking for, which is why we saw this morning a counter proposal from Democrats went over to Republicans as they review that. But we're looking at a shortened timeline here for them to get something done because a 2-week recess is upon the Hill, and that happens next week unless something changes.
Whoa. Okay, so we also understand that CBS News contacted all 532 House and Senate offices to ask lawmakers what they're doing to end the shutdown. What did they have to say? Is there a common thread in those phone calls and the responses?
Yeah, the common thread is the other side is to blame for this. Listen, hundreds of lawmakers, obviously we couldn't talk to them directly. We talked to a lot of staffers in their offices who said, hey, we'll get back to you, or sent over statements. But we got about 60 substantive responses from lawmakers in the House, which we think is a pretty notable lift there. Quite a few of them saying that a lot of this falls at the feet of the Senate, considering it's out of their hands. They've done what they've had to do. Now it's on the Senate to get something done. Take a listen to Representative LaLota. I think he represents the sentiment among folks in the House, eagerly waiting to see what happens out of the Senate.
I can sign on to a deal that doesn't give me 100% of what I want, but my Democrat colleagues need to stop moving the goalposts on this issue.
Instead of creating chaos, President Trump needs to get serious about finding a solution, and Republicans need to stop blocking TSA pay while dragging their feet on some very basic reforms.
And then last speaker there was Senator Pat Murray. She's the top-ranking Senate Appropriations Committee member, happens to be a Democrat. And behind her, it was a graphic that says 8 times Republicans blocked Democrats from funding TSA. That's because Democrats look to piecemeal it since the start of the shutdown, looking at bills that would fund every other agency except for ICE. As it stands now, though, we're still in that holding pattern to see if either side would be willing to budge. I can tell you, though, Reed, that we saw what happened last night. Leader Thune started a cloture motion on a DHS funding bill. That means either his proposal or a proposal that they broker with Democrats could get a vote as early as tomorrow. But whether or not that passes is something I guess we'll all be holding our breath for.
That's right. When you hear about those real life impacts, I mean, some TSA people sleeping in their cars, some losing their cars, it really lights a fire to get something done. Torian Small, thank you so much. Now let's talk about the war with Iran. President Trump says high-level talks with Iran are happening. And despite the president saying the U.S. has already won the war, Mr. Trump is expected to send thousands of additional U.S. troops to the Middle East. CBS News' Ed O'Keefe asked the president about a claim that Iran has given something of value to the United States, apparently related to the oil shipping route known as the Strait of Hormuz. Listen to that.
Do you think I trust them? I don't trust them.
Then why bother talking to them?
Because they're going to make a deal. They're going to make a deal. They did something yesterday that was amazing, actually. They gave us a present. And the present arrived today. And it was a very big present worth a tremendous amount of money. And I'm not going to tell you what that present is, but it was a very significant prize.
What's the present? What's the prize? And when will the president tell us? Meanwhile, Iranian officials are talking. They say they are only reviewing points from the U.S. for potential talks. Now, an Iranian military spokesperson released a statement mocking the president's claim, saying the U.S. is negotiating with itself. So let's drill down. Here's what we know Iran wants in order to end the war, including, by the way, payment for damages. They want a complete halt to aggression and assassinations. They want the establishment of mechanisms to ensure no future wars against Iran. They want the end of the war across all fronts and international recognition and guarantees of Iran's authority over the Strait of Hormuz. So live to the White House and CBS News correspondent Natalie Brand again today. So Natalie, any response from the White House on those demands from the Iranian regime?
Hi, Reed. Yeah, we are waiting for an official White House response to that report by Iran State TV, which laid out those conditions and also said that essentially the regime is rejecting the U.S. 15-point proposal. We are, as you know, expecting a White House press briefing later this hour, so there's no question that Caroline Leavitt will be asked about all of this. But, you know, a lot of mixed messages about where we are in these negotiations. And according to the Associated Press, some of the key elements of that proposal by the United States includes sanctions relief, Iran's nuclear program, which the president has publicly said is, you know, the top priority here, also limits on missiles and reopening the Strait of Hormuz. So you noted the conditions that Iran is trying to put forth that will likely get opposition, but what it's not clear is who exactly is the U.S. team negotiating with. The president has said it's not the supreme leader. The question remains, is it someone else in the regime? And countries who could potentially serve as mediators, including Egypt, have said in public statements today that they will continue efforts to try to bring the warring parties closer to a compromise. We know that Pakistan has also offered to, you know, facilitate these talks and trade messages. As for that gift that the president talked about yesterday to Ed O'Keefe, he seemed to bring it up to try to signal that progress is being made. He did not give details about what it was other than saying it's oil and gas related, Reed.
So as we await hearing what that gift of great value is, we know that America's men and women face deployment. We're talking about the deployment of the 82nd Airborne Division to the region. What specifically would they be doing there?
Yeah, and this is kind of a rapid response brigade based in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And sources tell CBS News that elements of it are expected to be potentially deployed, including a command element and some ground forces. A U.S. official saying it would be under 1,500 troops. Now, CBS News has reported that this is part of Pentagon planning if ground troops were to be deployed. The White House has reiterated that, this doesn't mean a decision has been made by the president, but that he wants to retain optionality and have plans in place. And it would add to the forces that we've already learned, the thousands of Marines and sailors that departed from California heading to the region to kind of serve as reinforcement. So there's clear that there is an increased military buildup if these talks break down. And we kind of have this clock, Reed, of this 5-day period when the president said that he was postponing the threat to strike Iran's power plans to kind of let what he called productive talks take place. But a lot of questions for the press secretary this afternoon.
We await that update. Natalie Brand, we know you'll have it when you see it and you'll bring it to us from the White House. Thank you so much, friend. When we come back, we have new video showing the moment an American man held for months by the Taliban finally steps off of that airplane and into the arms of his loved ones in Texas. You're watching CBS News 24/7. We're back after the break. Welcome back, everybody. We've got some breaking news in that social media addiction trial against Meta and other social media giants playing out in Los Angeles. Of course, this comes on the 9th day of deliberations in that landmark case, deciding if social media platforms are, in fact, addictive and harmful for children. So let's go to CBS News legal contributor Caroline Polisi. Caroline, this case on its merits really raised a lot of eyebrows, especially for parents like you and me, but also because we got some signals from the jury in deliberation for so many days that they were having a hard time coming to a decision. What are you expecting here?
Yeah, that's right, Reed. First off, I would say whichever way this shakes out, this is a really monumental case for big tech jurisprudence. Meta is coming off of another decision yesterday, a big loss for them, $375 million in damages in a New Mexico case. But essentially, this case is different from that case. What this case is alleging, essentially, is that this individual plaintiff known as Kaylee, that she essentially became addicted to Meta and YouTube platforms at the age really of 6 to 9, and that it really caused her substantial mental health issues. I think, the question that you asked about which way the jury is leaning, that note that they gave over to the judge a couple of days ago indicated that they had in fact found liability, but that they were unsure about the number in terms of damages. So remember, this case is against Meta and YouTube, so the jury has to decide two separate issues, as if really these were two separate trials to begin with, based on a liability standpoint.
That's a tall order for a jury. For our viewers who are just logging on or tuning in, a verdict has been reached in this social media addiction trial. We expect those jurors will be stepping out of the courtroom now that that verdict has been reached to let us know what it is. As soon as we see that, you'll see that. But continuing the conversation with Caroline Polisi, what are the implications going forward for these platforms? Because I would imagine that the case yesterday, even though it's not the same as this case, it would establish precedent, would it not?
Absolutely. And these both are really bellwether cases that both, people that cover big tech as well as really the citizenry at large, parents at large, are really paying close attention to. Yesterday's case was brought by the New Mexico government, by the state attorney in that state, but there are about 40 other state attorneys general throughout the country that have brought similar cases. And the verdict yesterday had to do with child sexual exploitation and whether or not these platforms, or Meta in particular, was aware of the child sexual abuse taking place on its platform. And the jury resoundingly found that, yes, it engaged in unconscionable practices, that it knowingly put children in danger because it was interested in profits. Now, the issue for the California trial here today is not so much, or not at all, rather about the content, because historically social media platforms have been shielded from liability for the content that users put on their platform. But today's verdict really goes to the heart of the engineering and the science behind these platforms. So we're talking about things like notifications, likes, these tools that, let you gain followers and things like that. We heard testimony from the plaintiff in this case that she became addicted to Instagram and YouTube for the likes. She would sort of leave school to go to the bathroom to check these platforms, and that she was essentially up all night on them. And so really the issue is, was this a harmful predatory tactic that Meta and YouTube really knew about, which is getting people really to become addicted to these platforms? And just like you said, I think any parent understands the inherent dangers of these platforms. And I think adults really do too. They described it, the plaintiff's attorneys described this as like a real addiction, a chemical difference in your brain that wants those likes, wants to keep scrolling. So it could be a real bellwether case, because there are thousands more pending all across the country.
I mean, in the lawsuits and the cases against Big Tobacco, addiction had to be addressed in the courtroom, and therefore in the process, addiction really got a hard, cold definition. As we cover these cases and as we wait learning what this verdict is in this social media addiction trial, I think the viewing public often gets hung up on the dollar figures, what people are suing for in a monetary sense. But oftentimes, litigants sue going after that dollar figure for the ultimate goal of seeing societal change, a change in an industry, a change in wrongs that have been alleged. Do you see any changes that can be made that could come out of either of these cases, New Mexico or this case that we're still waiting for the verdict on, that could actually force and be a thrust for change in our world?
Absolutely, Reed. And the only way, I think it's acknowledged, the only way to hit these companies is to get to their bottom line, their bottom dollar, hit them where it hurts, which is money. And that's really the hallmark of a civil case. The only remedy is in monetary damages. In civil cases in general, you have two types of damages. You have compensatory damages and punitive damages. Compensatory damages are meant to make the plaintiff whole, to sort of reimburse them for expenses, perhaps therapy expenses or pain and suffering that they've endured from the liability. Now, punitive damages are only to punish the defendant, because that's really the only way a civil case can punish a defendant, through their pocketbook. So, yesterday's verdict, it sounds big, $375 million, but when you look at the trillions-dollar market share that these just behemoth companies have, it wasn't that big in the scheme of things. But again, it does show a willingness on the part of both the government and regular citizens to sort of have this new appetite to take on big companies like this. And certainly, I think based on whatever the monetary penalty could be in this case, will have far-reaching ramifications, because the fact is, nothing will stop these companies unless it hits their bottom line, unless it starts to make a monetary impact on their profits.
Well, and hitting at one bottom line can invite challenges for more hits as well. Just like the concept of addiction got a lot of, scrutiny in this trial, so also did parental responsibility. Talk to us about what some of the arguments were where that's concerned, and whether those could actually have sway in, again, establishing precedent, that definition of parental responsibility specifically to kids and social media.
Yeah, absolutely. So the plaintiff in this case, remember, she's a 20-year-old woman now, but she's making these allegations based on her time over childhood growing up on these platforms. And the defense really hitting hard back, trying to show a pattern of potentially neglect, turmoil, abuse, both physical and verbal, in her growing up, saying that, that was really the substantial cause of her mental illness, of some of these suicidal ideations, some body dysmorphia issues, saying that she turned to social media and these platforms because there was this pre-existing condition. Now, the plaintiffs are pushing back, saying actually it was the addiction itself that became a substantial contributing factor to her depression, anxiety, suicidal ideations. And so you have this back and forth over causality, right? So we're kind of in new legal territory here when we're talking about things like whether or not there is a definition of social media addiction. The defense really pushing back, saying, really cross-examining the plaintiff's therapist, asking, did you ever write in your notes? Did you diagnose her with an addiction to social media? And the therapist saying, well, no, that's not really, I didn't really have that as part of my toolkit. And so we're seeing a whole new realm of sort of liability here. Again, the defense saying social media addiction isn't a mental health issue, that parents obviously need to take on some of the burden here. But again, I think as we all know, it's just you're fighting an uphill battle when some of these features are available to children. But they're also arguing, the plaintiffs were also arguing that these features like the constant notifications and sort of the gathering of likes and in particular these Instagram filters, that those had a contributing factor as well.
All right, Caroline Polisi, thank you so much. And right here in my hand, I just got what the jury found. So let's get that right now to you. The jury found that Meta and YouTube are liable, both of them, on all charges. They then voted to award $3 million in damages, 70% responsibility given to Meta, 30% given to YouTube. Certainly more to come on this story. So now that we know how the jury found in this case, let's go to Los Angeles live. And CBS News senior business and tech correspondent Jolene Kent. You've been covering this for weeks, Jolene. We're understanding jurors are about to step out to let us know. And one more time, just for our viewers, $3 million in damages, 70% coming out of the pockets of Meta, 30% coming out of the pockets of YouTube.
Reed, the key thing here is that the jury has found that Meta and YouTube are liable on all charges brought by the plaintiff. And so when you look at that and you zoom out and you think about what happened yesterday in New Mexico, where that jury found Meta liable for exploitation and a lack of safety for younger users on their platforms, these two verdicts in the span of about 24 hours mark a watershed moment for social media companies and even more so for families with kids on social media. These are the first two cases of thousands of cases that are expected to find their way through the legal system against social media platforms in a way that holds their products, their algorithms accountable. We have never seen this happen before. In my 15 years of covering social media, there have been so many attempts to regulate from the federal level or the state level, individual cases brought, but now we are seeing an inflection point. We're awaiting a statement from Meta as to what their response is here, and we look forward to hearing from the jury. But this particular finding from the jury, this verdict, Meta and YouTube both liable on all charges in this LA Superior Court case, in addition to the New Mexico State Attorney General's case that was won yesterday by the state of New Mexico. I mean, this is an incredibly important moment. I expect, as Meta said in New Mexico, they plan to appeal that case. Of course, this is likely to be appealed. We're waiting for the Meta statement on this, but we're talking about features that were discussed in court, like infinite scroll, autoplay, the plaintiff saying that these were factors in addicting her to the apps, affecting her mental health, including depression, anxiety, body dysmorphia. And when I zoom out and think about all of the different young people and families I've interviewed over the years who've had these challenges with social media, her testimony very much reflected what we had been reporting. So it'll be interesting to see what else the jury says, what both sides, what the attorneys on both sides have to say as they step out of LA Superior Court. But this is a trial where Mark Zuckerberg himself, the founder of Facebook, the CEO of Meta, was forced to testify and take the stand. We were in the room that day when that happened, and he was directly addressing the jury, trying to make the case that there was never any intention for his company, by his company, to create addictive products. But this is a major moment, Reed, and we are looking forward to getting more detail. But we do know that this is likely to be appealed and is likely to be perhaps even a Supreme Court battle as we continue forward. But the jury in LA Superior Court finding that Meta and YouTube both liable on all charges, $3 million in damages to the plaintiff, 70% responsibility to Meta, and 30% responsibility to YouTube.
You know, you mentioned it's a watershed moment, and I think if you boil it all down to the bones, for one reason, if only for one reason, and that is precedent, because this could pave the way for other similar actions unless social media companies do what the plaintiffs allege, which is social responsibility as a social media platform. What changes do you think the people who sued would like to see happen for my kids who are on social media, for other people's children?
There's a prevailing movement to have younger children just not be on social media. And so there is a hope throughout this community of activists and parents and families saying that they'd like to see a social media ban, so to speak, for 16 and under. That's something that's already underway in places like Australia. It's being considered in countries in Europe right now. But the issue here is that because there was no federal regulation, you know, the tech companies will tell you until you're blue in the face that they want to be regulated. The lawmakers have told us we have proposed legislation, but it never got through, oftentimes never to the floor to a vote in the Senate and House. And so even though these intentions have been spoken in such a way, there has been a lack of federal guidance and regulation on this front, which has led to today. And so the precedents that might be set today and yesterday in New Mexico will be useful to those who are filing these lawsuits, who are in process in different state courts around the country. And we also expect a multi-district litigation in Oakland to begin later this year as well. And so this is a coalescing of momentum on behalf of the families and advocates who say, you know, enough is enough. The question is, in the New Mexico trial, for example, Reed, what kind of changes will be required that Meta should have to make per the court there in New Mexico? Will additional damages have to be paid there? There's a lot of open questions on whether or not this will lead to substantive change when it comes to that product that your kids or that you are scrolling.
Right, and definition still happening in real time while the technology now grows into the AI space. Jolene Kent, really appreciate the conversation as we break this news. Once again, jury finds that Meta and YouTube are liable on all charges in that case down in LA. I anticipate you'll be back here on CBS News 24/7 and also later this evening in other CBS broadcasts. We appreciate you. So let's get to CBS News legal contributor one more time, Caroline Polisi. You know, Jolene brought up a really good point, and that is anticipating an appeal like we heard about in the New Mexico case, even all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. You know, you and I have these conversations about how oftentimes in these court cases, things really get cemented by definition. The U.S. Supreme Court may actually end up being a part of cementing in some definitions, no?
Yeah, absolutely. And this case and yesterday's verdict, obviously watershed, not really, let's be honest, Reed, for the dollar amount, $3 million, you know, is a drop in the bucket for Meta and YouTube. And I can tell you they spent a lot more than $3 million defending this case. And the reason they did is the point that you've been making. It's for the precedential value, because now there are potential plaintiffs out there all over the country saying, I was affected by these products. I too could win a lawsuit of this nature, and it incentivizes these companies to settle or to maybe change their tactics when they see their bottom line sort of coming into play here. The rule of thumb really is that the law catches up to society about 10 years later, and so I think we've all known for at least a decade that social media is not good for children, for their mental health, and the studies are bearing that out now. But now we're seeing it sort of trickle into the court system, and you're seeing novel, new ways of trying to find liability. So the New Mexico case was a products liability case. This case was a different theory based on, like a negligent and unconscionable way to go about business practices. So there's a lot of new law being made. The question is, when will the legislature step in to regulate these companies? I think it's a wonderful verdict and a wonderful precedent for people that are hopeful that maybe we can make changes, but it's going to take some time. So for a case, yes, these cases will be appealed. Meta, YouTube will fight this with every ounce of their being, because they don't want this precedent. But I think we will see some other fields and some other issues playing out in different realms.
Yeah, it's like a million legs, on a centipede. One of those legs, of course, is about the functionality, the endless scrolling, but also, we've had the conversation in the recent past about social media companies and whether they actually should moderate the content, have some sort of content protection. For instance, somebody gets doxxed on social media for whatever reason. That's content on their platform hosting falsehoods about a person, a business, an organization. Do you think that these decisions could then open up a path where people could litigate relative to the content on these platforms?
Yeah, absolutely. That wasn't at issue today, but certainly yesterday in the New Mexico case, what was at issue there, what the defense there was essentially there is a statute, a regulation indicating that platforms like these are responsible for the content that its users put out. So it plays into really a First Amendment right. But we saw really a breakdown of that statute yesterday in this verdict, because the jury ruled that they engaged in unconscionable practices in ignoring that content, right? They were aware that there were predators using their platforms to endanger children, and that they willfully ignored it. So today's verdict, again, not about that content, but about the way that this product is engineered. And it's knowingly, Reed, okay? It's not that they just turned a blind eye to it or didn't know about it. It's that they actively understood that, and they were taking advantage of young people's sort of inexperience, their, sort of underdeveloped brains, and they're rewiring really that interplay. And so when you have these endless scroll features, they know that that's an addictive feature because they want to keep eyeballs on their product. So, I think, again, we're seeing a lot play out in this field. The legal sphere is catching up with sort of, the society at large in terms of what we're seeing based on a scientific level.
Okay, we're going to keep this shot up as we look at the television. Can we put that shot back up, guys, outside the courtroom? Caroline, aside from the decision here, the verdict from those jurors, as somebody who has worked very much behind these very fancy walls, give us an idea of what's going on with the jury, because we do have this live picture there. You do see a lot of cameras, and the viewing public may not know what is about to happen for this jury. We're going to see who they are, and we're going to hear their reasoning, no?
It depends, Reed. So different jurisdictions, the judge can, instruct the jurors whichever way he or she wants, but ultimately it is each juror's independent decision whether or not to speak to reporters. As a defense attorney, I can tell you it is like gold to get a plaintiff to talk to you to see what really worked. I mean, I would be willing to bet that these companies put together mock trials and then interviewed those mock jurors to see what resonated with the jury. And so that is really, for sure, there are going to be more cases like this. And so if the defense and the prosecution can glean any information from those jurors, absolutely, they will want to get that information. And I would think that in a trial, of this substantial nature, that you would get at least some jurors willing to give interviews, willing to talk about, what their thought process was.
Whether they know it or not, they have nudged the needle and nudged the world a little bit with their decision. Once again, if you're just tuning in or watching live in the palm of your hand, Meta and YouTube found liable on all charges in that landmark social media addiction trial. Caroline Polisi, you make me smarter and walk taller whenever I'm with you. I appreciate you so much. We'll be right back. We'll continue the conversation on this verdict as we await those jurors to leave that courtroom and let the world know why they voted in that jury room to hold Meta and YouTube responsible. Continuing breaking news coverage here on CBS News 24/7. You see right here outside of that courtroom A lot of people waiting with cameras. They are waiting to hear from jurors who just handed down a landmark ruling. Meta and YouTube just received a guilty verdict in a landmark trial focusing on social media addiction and mental health. So let's talk to CBS News correspondent Chanel Call following this in the newsroom. Chanel, we understand that we're starting to hear now from the social media company.
Yeah, we were actually waiting for this verdict for 9 days now, 9 days of deliberations. Now we have a verdict. The jury finding that Meta and YouTube are both liable on all charges. They voted to award $3 million in damages to KGM. That is, of course, the 20-year-old woman who brought this case against the social media companies Meta, YouTube, Snap, and TikTok. Now, you will remember that Snap and TikTok actually settled with KGM, the woman who brought this suit forward, before the jury was selected. So this trial was really focused on both Meta and YouTube. The jury also finding Meta will be responsible for 70% Meta for 70% and YouTube 30%. And you mentioned reaction. We are just getting reaction this hour from Meta spokesperson Lisa Crenshaw in a statement saying, quote, "We respectfully disagree with the verdict and are evaluating our legal options." So at this point, also in the note, it says that the jurors were not unanimous and the compensatory damages were just $3 million. It also says they plan to have more to share after punitive damages are assessed.
Okay, Chanel Call with that reaction while we await that emergence of some of the jurors to come out and talk about why they made those decisions, especially now that that statement came out where it looks like Meta's attorneys are zeroing in on non-unanimous. So let's talk about that. CBS News legal contributor Caroline Polisi joining us now. Were you struck by that, or did that catch your ear about drilling down on non-unanimous?
I knew they'd say that, Reed, because the note that we heard about that the jurors, asked the judge about said, essentially, gave the indication that they weren't unanimous. But fun fact, in California state court, civil cases don't need to have unanimity to find liability. They only need 9 out of the 12 jurors to agree. So, that is not something that many people think of when they think of trials. They obviously think, certainly in a criminal trial, you need unanimity, and often in some civil cases as well. But funny quirk of California state law. So the fact that Meta's bringing that up as though it's a defect in sort of the way that this case was decided by the jurors is potentially disingenuous. Those are the rules of the game. But obviously, they're also homing in on the small dollar amount. I mean, small, we say in the sort of big picture here, $3 million in compensatory damages isn't that much. I would like to know whether or not punitive damages were on the table. That's when you get those really, really high numbers. Remember, we talked about what damages represent. Punitive damages are for punishment. So, I would be interested to see how that goes. But certainly, they're gonna fight this case, both Meta and YouTube, as far as they can get.
So I'm curious, if they're really drilling down on what we understand about the jury not being unanimous in this, if that is what they're going to stand on, if those are the boots on their feet, so to speak, what's the threshold to really have some force or some thrust to that argument?
Yeah, I think they'll probably make some sort of argument. They'll try to poll the jurors, right, to see whether or not there was any sort of bullying or intimidation. There was reporting that there was one juror that had a non-refundable vacation leaving tomorrow, and whether or not sort of, that was a pressure point on the negotiations. But, more likely, I think they will appeal this verdict on legal grounds, invalidating the theory on which the plaintiffs brought this case, or something about the evidentiary standard or the evidence that was brought into the case. More so really on the New Mexico case, because that was much bigger damages. We saw that was a theory of liability that really does have long-lasting legal implications, that has to do with actually regulating the content on some of these platforms, which before now we really haven't seen because of these robust First Amendment rights. But certainly these companies are going to be spending millions of dollars on very high-powered attorneys to look into every avenue of appeal.
You know, I'm looking at these court sketches, and of course, we see by design that they are faceless because we really haven't known much about the identity of the person who brought this suit. Now that this is at least over for now, maybe looking at appeals, do you anticipate that there would be any incentive for her to come forward and really put a human face on this story to the American public?
Yeah, potentially. There is, a favor in American law for disclosure, right? We sort of, as the American public, have a right to know the identities of plaintiffs that bring cases. And so the fact that she was identified only by her initials, she was also called Kaylee throughout the trial, was a judgment call on the part of the judge. I mean, typically you only reserve that kind of anonymity for children. Now, she was alleging the conduct here when she was a child, but she's a 20-year-old woman now. So I would think, I think it's probably known what her identity is. We'll see if she, voluntarily comes forward.
We would love to have that interview exclusive right here on CBS News 24/7. Caroline Polisi, thank you so much. All right, let's turn a page now. In its daily update, the United Arab Emirates says it intercepted 9 Iranian drones today, marking Iran lashing out on other nations in that region. CBS News foreign correspondent Chris Livesay reports on the impacts from Dubai.
Well, as there is talk about potential negotiations between the United States and Iran, the Gulf states are caught in the middle. And one thing is for sure, they do not want the status quo. Dubai and the Emirates, where I am, the Emirates have been struck more than Israel since this conflict began. And that's not even mentioning the Strait of Hormuz, which has been turned into a parking lot, a fifth of the world's oil normally passing through that narrow strait that has been turned into a trickle. Also, U.S. interests in Dubai that have been struck, like the U.S. consulate. There's also an Amazon data processing center here that was struck. All of it's created uncertainty, and it has turned not just the local economy, but the global economy upside down. Meanwhile, you have Iran that is making some very steep demands. It's not just calling for reparations to the order of billions of dollars from the United States. It's also calling on the United States to completely leave the region, and it wants to turn the Strait of Hormuz into its own sovereign territory, effectively turning it into its own private toll booth. Again, something that the Emirates and that the Gulf states simply cannot tolerate. Back to you.
Chris Livesay, thank you. Investigators now zeroing in on the final moments before a plane and a fire truck collided. You see the impact there at New York's LaGuardia Airport. 2 pilots killed, a flight attendant actually thrown out of that plane, still buckled into her seat, dozens more injured. CBS News New York's Tim McNicholas is at that airport where the runway today, it remains closed.
The NTSB arrived about 2 hours ago, and there are Port Authority crews around the plane out there right now as we're speaking. Traffic is still limited here with a closed runway. Video and images from the crash survivors are painting a clearer picture of the wreckage and their stories.
I saw a lot of panic.
Painting a clearer picture of the horror inside the plane.
I looked out the window. I wasn't sure, if this was it. I wasn't sure if the plane was going to spin out of control. These thoughts started to surface, like this might be the last moment that I have.
Passenger Rachel Mariotti says she then saw a man bleeding to her right. As of Tuesday night, 6 victims were still in the hospital, down from 39 right after the collision. Investigators revealed Tuesday there were 2 controllers working in the tower on the midnight shift.
The midnight shift, as a reminder, is one that we have many times at the NTSB raised concerns about with respect to fatigue. Again, I do not know. We have no indication that was a factor here, but it is a shift that we have been focused on in past investigations.
The NTSB is still investigating whether fatigue played a role. Air traffic control cleared the Air Canada jet to land on runway 4, then cleared the Port Authority truck to cross that same runway. Investigators say a safety system called ASDX, designed to detect runway movement, did not alert controllers to the danger.
In order for ASDX to work well, you have to know where ground vehicles and aircraft are. So in this case, that vehicle did not have a transponder.
The NTSB says one other safety tool was working, the runway status lights, which flash red to alert vehicles about traffic on the runway. All of that will be a part of the NTSB probe.
All right, so let's go from New York to the other side of the country, Los Angeles. Meta and YouTube found liable on all charges in that landmark social media addiction trial. There is a dollar figure assessed to that in damages from a jury. $3 million in damages to a woman 20 years old now, makes the case based on what happened in her teenage years, saying she went through depression and suicidal ideation incident to addiction to social media. And now Meta is having to respond to the fact that 70% of that $3 million judgment goes to Meta, 30% to YouTube. What's happening right here? We are awaiting members of the jury to step out and talk about this landmark decision. You're watching CBS News 24/7. The news continues.